Good morning, MSc students. It's Wildlands League, and we're happy to be here. We've got a long history with the U of T, presenting usually in person at least once a year, often to the MSc class, but to other classes as well. And yeah, I did the MSc program a long time ago, so I know kind of what you're going through, but these are unprecedented times, so we really hope you're doing well and keeping safe. So today we've got Janet, our Executive Director, and Anna Baggio, our Director of Conservation Planning. But I'm going to let you guys, Janet and Anna, introduce yourselves directly to MFC students.
Do you want us to do that now, Dave?
Sure.
Or when we start. Hi, I'm Janet Sumner. I'm the Executive Director at Wildlands League. We're an incredibly effective environmental group that's been around for over 50 years. We started in 1968. I love the work that I do, and I actually really enjoy the time that we get to spend with the MFC students at U of T, which is almost on an annual basis, so it's really fantastic for me, and I'm glad that we can make the time today to do that.
Great.
Yeah, it's Anna Baggio. I'm the Conservation Director for Wildlands League, and thank you for having us back. And I hope you're all staying safe and that you're not too bored at home, only communicating by Zoom and other computer safe ways. So thank you for having us on board, and let's see what happens.
And I'm Dave Pierce. Thanks, Janet and Anna. I'm a Forest Conservation Manager, and I work a lot with forest companies. And again, really happy to be able to talk to you guys today. And we are going to be talking mostly about forestry today. So I'm just going to share my screen, and we'll get started. So like I said, we kind of have a forestry expertise at Wildlands League. And we've been around, as Janet said, for a long time, since 1968. And we're focused on obsessed really with coming up with real world solutions to conserving wild spaces, especially in Ontario, but across the country. And we work with a lot of other organizations and communities and industries and Indigenous leaders at all levels, and focused on trying to get more protected areas. But outside of that, we try to make resource extraction more sustainable. And we've recently branched into marine protection, which is very exciting. And maybe Anna can get a little plug in for that, but we're going to be sticking mostly to forestry today. So I'm going to give an overview of something called a program we call Logging Scars, where we've uncovered a pretty substantial deforestation problem. Janet's going to do a bit of a deeper dive on the logging scars and the carbon storage implications of deforestation in Ontario. And then Anna's going to be talking about how government rollbacks of regulations is making the problem worse, but showing really how it doesn't have to be that way. And we have some solutions, especially around caribou, that she'll be excited to share with you. Like I said, we've been working on forestry for years, trying to find ways to get more conservation outcomes while maintaining a healthy forest industry and communities. We've looked at harvest levels, how to get more parks established, caribou conservation. We were part of the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement, and we were founding members of FSC, and we still work on FSC Forest Stewardship Council certification. But in all this work, we would do a lot of traveling in the north and flying over the north, and we'd see really a pattern, even in old clear cuts, of these patches that didn't look like they were coming back as forests. And our Trevor Hesselink in our office in particularly was taken with this. And we'd ask foresters, and they'd say, well, you know, it's probably landings and roads and stuff, but they'll come back. They'll grow back over time. And Trevor in particular was not buying it. He was like, this is not happening. So in his work, he really discovered that we do have, indeed, we have a deforestation problem. And we found this incredible because governments, as I was saying, governments and industry have been saying for years that Canada has near zero deforestation and these areas are going to grow back. But it's not what we were seeing in the bush. So Trevor especially, we decided to take a closer look. And what we found is a pretty massive ignored footprint of industrial logging that happened on our public lands. And these are cumulatively, they're vast areas that are treeless and barren. As we said, we're calling them logging scars that are persisting for decades. And these really impact and threaten wildlife like caribou, and they counteract our efforts as a country, as Canada's efforts to mitigate climate change. So in this study, we found that there were, every year, 22,000 hectares are deforested in the boreal forests of Ontario. So over the past 30 years, that adds up to an estimated 650,000 hectares of forest that have been lost. That is, you know, 2/3 the size of Algonquin Park. It's the size of Lake Nipigon. It's about 10 times the area of Toronto. So it's a huge area. By 2030, when Canada's supposed to be hitting its Paris Climate Agreement targets, the amount of lost carbon sequestration that should be sequestered would be equivalent to over a year of emissions from all the passenger vehicles in Canada. So when Trevor went out and did his research, he actually went out and measured the impacts of the roads and the landings, the other disturbances. He started out using remote sensing, but he actually went out on the field and he bought a drone and drove, and he mountain biked around and hiked and did what he needed to do to get on the ground verification of what he'd seen remotely. And so what he found was in the first 3 decades after logging, the roads and landings typically remain barren of trees. And this has been ignored by the officials, as we said, because there's this optimistic belief that all these affected areas will grow back. And amazingly, that really hasn't been scrutinized and had the tires kicked on it till now. And the main problem is what happens as a result of what's called full tree harvesting, where you pull the entire tree, the trunk, the limbs, and the branches. They're still leaving the stumps in the ground and the roots for now. They're dragged to the roadside, and at the roadside, the merchantable area is cut out, and then the logs, and they're stripped of the branches and the tops. And all the unmerchantable pieces or the unmerchantable species are left behind, and the tree waste, it accumulates, and it basically smothers any regrowth. And then the compaction of the heavy industry also takes a toll of the heavy machinery, because you've got roads and you've got machinery running up and down beside the roads, and it compacts the soil. So that all has a cumulative effect. And what Trevor did, he sampled over 300 sites using remote imagery, and then he ground truthed almost 1/10 of those, almost 10%, 27 of those sites. And many are within caribou ranges. Here we have the Churchill and the Bright Sand and the Nipigon caribou ranges in northwestern Ontario. And these areas are under tenure to companies that supply tissue manufacturers, lumber industry. And what happens with these logging scars when it comes to caribou, they impact many times the area for caribou habitat. And the caribou are slowly being squeezed out. So all the pink lines on this map are roads and landings, and so and then the sampled areas are the yellow circles there. But the implication is, of course, it goes beyond those sampled areas. And so our findings may be only like the tip of the iceberg. So it's very clear to us that business as usual forestry and this type of forestry shouldn't be permitted in the last remaining intact boreal forest in Canada. We're in a climate crisis, an extinction emergency. We need to restore these kinds of areas, and governments and forest companies need to use their resources to measure these impacts more fully and make really evidence-based decisions. And companies need to step up and demand the same from the forest companies that are supplying, tissue, lumber, all those things. So you can go to our website, loggingscars.ca, for a deeper dive. And then when you go there, click on the Explore link, and you can see the extent of deforestation for yourself. Now I'm going to turn it over to Janet. she's going to do a bit of a deeper dive on this and really take a look at some of the forestry implications or the carbon implications of this type of forestry. So go ahead, Janet.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for walking everybody through the logging scars and the impacts. You may hear us often reference our colleague Trevor, who did this foundational study and whose work, much of the rest of what we're talking about is built upon this research that he did, spending 2 years out in the bush, figuring out what the real impact of full tree harvesting was. And while all of what Dave mentioned is very important for Ontario, it should be realized that full tree harvesting is being used across Canada. And when we use Google Earth, just to go scrolling across the country, you can see the signature footprint that we see here in this image reflected across the country. What hasn't been done is the ground truthing of that. And what it also indicates, because we haven't done that, we don't really know what the true carbon cost is. And so Trevor and I decided to do a little bit of the math behind what the carbon cost would be just for one area. He had originally looked at 290 sites or thereabouts in northwestern Ontario. Pardon me, but as I said, the carbon costs are wherever you're having full tree harvesting. And we chose very deliberately only to look at the above ground carbon costs, because when you start to look at the below ground carbon costs, we suspect that they are significant, but there's multiple layers to that. And we wanted to keep it a very clean and simple argument and see if that alone had a story to tell. And it did. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of that. So again, it's built on the premise that full tree harvesting, when you look at it, here's a typical example of what Trevor found was that you see after 30 years, you've got these areas that are largely left barren. You might have some bushes that have grown up, but for all intents and purposes, they have not returned to the tree stands. And then we asked ourselves, well, what would happen if you didn't cut an area that was destined to be harvested? It was an area that we looked at where we had a considerable amount of work that we had done. We only did this as a paper exercise, so we have not gone out into the field. But we started to think, what would we do based on our knowledge and looking at this area? And we looked at Northeast Ontario, where Moose Cree have said they would like to have an area protected. And it's called the North French Watershed. It's a large, intact boreal tract of forest. We've been working there actually probably now almost a dozen years. There's lots of co-benefits to protecting this area. One is a big one is reconciliation. The First Nations have a desire to see this area protected. It's a drinking water source. It helps the company because they don't want to actually spend the money to go up into this, the furthest reaches, the furthest away from mill, et cetera, area. And so it has a lot going for it. It also, if you don't harvest it and you do move it into protection, it helps achieve some of the federal goals around protecting 30% of the country. So, and it's ongoing. We have ongoing partnerships with industry and First Nations in this area. So it was an area that was just right for us to take a look at. Here's a better picture of it. This dark pink is the area that is zoned for logging. And so by the numbers, we started to look at this and said, what if we were to not harvest here? Again, being very circumspect about the numbers and trying to be conservative, we started from the premise that we have 666,000 hectares of the North French watershed. Only 451,000 of those are zoned currently for forestry. Then Trevor did the math using netting out water, riparian areas, and a few other pieces, and we got to an estimate net of 300,000 hectares. We think this is a conservative estimate again. It's always good when the conservative estimate proves the case, and so that's what we started with. Of that area, we wanted to figure out what would be the actual area that would be barren after 30 years. We were thinking in a time frame of, if you talk about 2020 to 2050, that's a 30-year time frame. So we said, well, what would be barren in it, what would be gone? That would be approximately 15%. Now, when we've subsequently done the math, so let me just rephrase that. Trevor's analysis in Northwest came back with a figure somewhere around 14.1%. We haven't done the calculation for the adjacent forestry, and that would be something that would need to be proved out, and we would need to ground truth this. But again, using an approximation of about 15%, we said of that 300,000, when you netted out all the riparian, et cetera, and you said 15% of that area is not going to come back in that 30-year time span, that would be about 45,000 hectares. So then there are 3 separate carbon impacts. The primary forest stock that you remove that would have been standing on those where you would have new logging scars. And he used a number of 23 tons of carbon per hectare. And that's from a study by Peng et al. And then you get just over 1 billion tons of carbon. And again, these are carbon numbers. They're not CO2 equivalent numbers, and we'll get to that at the end. Then you have the fate of the waste wood from slashing alone. The conventional fate is usually burning within the first 5 years, or it's set to decomposition. You cut the entire area, which is the 300,000, using the loss, again, using that number of 23 tons, you get just over, just about 7 billion tons of carbon. And that is what would be removed. And then from that, about 25% of it, that's the approximation, would be left on the forest floor. So that's 1,725,000 tons of carbon. So we're starting to rack up the numbers. And then you get to the lack of renewal. What does the lack of renewal on the logging scars footprint over time? So again, you have a 20-year increment. We use 20 years for this calculation. Use the, we looked at, you'll see the number used an approximation using a Boreal Scots pine, 1 ton of carbon per hectare per year. Over 20 years, that 45,000 hectares results in about 900,000 tons of carbon. So when you bring all 3 combined together, you end up over a 20-year period having 3,660,000 tons of carbon. And that CO2 equivalent is almost, is just over 13 megatons in a 20-year period. That is enormous. When you think of Canada's, I think their gap on their emissions right now is about 77 megatons. So this is 13 megatons in one forestry area where you would avoid an impact by not logging. So we also looked at the other part of the country where we have worked, and this is in Northeast Alberta, where seismic lines run right through Alberta. I don't know if you've ever been there, but I've flown over many of these units. And we looked at an area that was about 9 million hectares of forest management area, and it had a seismic footprint of 100,000 kilometers with an average width of 4 meters. Now, seismic, what they do is they basically take a truck and they drop a seismic explosion. It gives them a footprint of what's underground. Then the truck keeps moving on. And so you get these linear features in the landscape that stay barren for many years, much like logging scars. And they don't come back. And in fact, because they get so much use from vehicular traffic that might be wanting to access areas for fishing, et cetera, they just stay open, and they're open scars on the landscape. So we wanted to look at what would happen if you were to try to restore these, and what would be the carbon benefit of a restoration. It's a clear place where you can say there's no trees standing. It's basically almost a dirt road. What would happen if you were to do restoration in this area? We worked on these numbers with ALPAC, and we had conversations with them about what those restorations numbers would look like. And this is where we checked on the Boreal Scots pine number and used our conversations with them to say, is this analogous for Canada? Because it was the only number that we could find that we felt a good degree of certainty about. Anyway, in this 100,000 kilometers, if you were to restore that, you'd get about 40,000 hectares. And over that 20-year period, it would give you 800,000 tons of carbon, or just shy of 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. So we've got a very large area, 9 million hectares, that you're going to go about doing all the restoration on that footprint, and you're going to get 3 billion tons of carbon, or by avoiding forestry, you could get 13 billion tons, 13 megatons, 13 billion tons. Big difference. And as Dave already walked you through, in Ontario alone, we have about 21,700 hectares that are deforested each year. That results in about 41 megatons of CO2 equivalent that is lost in this productive forest in Ontario alone. That means Canada has a carbon debt that we're not counting, because we don't count this carbon. It's also a lost opportunity to realize a carbon benefit as well. And maybe I'll just walk you through that. So right now, Canada has a policy where they want to plant 2 billion trees. As you can see, that may or may not realize us some carbon benefits over a 20-year timescale. Certainly planting or restoring the 100,000 kilometers in Northeast Alberta could net you approximately 3 megatons. That 3 megatons would need to be verified. These numbers, again, are back of the envelope. There's going to be some regrowth that has already occurred on the seismic footprint. You'd need to discount that. But you could get some megatons from that. We're not discounting that. But you certainly get a lot more from the avoided impact by avoiding forestry. So why is it we're choosing to plant 2 billion trees versus saying, and Anna will talk more about this, about saying, why don't we start protecting some caribou habitat, avoiding the carbon loss, and actually saving ourselves this carbon debt? Well, there's a few reasons for that. Canada currently admits to almost zero deforestation. So if you don't have a loss, then avoiding it doesn't actually get you any benefit. And the reason we don't admit to any loss is in the definition, that deforestation occurs when there's a land use change. So if we still are doing forestry on that particular parcel of land, it's not considered a land use change. It's just considered the general operations of the forest. But there's no way, even if you had aggressive replanting, that those logging scars would come back by 2050, which is really what our target year is, right? It's like, do we have the carbon that can come back by 2050? As you've seen from Trevor's logging scars work, we're looking at 30 years and trees have not returned. So we don't acknowledge or count the carbon loss from logging, even as degradation as well. We just basically see it as part of the logging schema. And it's not limited to logging. We haven't looked at the numbers yet, but we know that there's a footprint from mineral exploration when we look at the Ring of Fire. And we know that we've got roads that are being carved into intact landscapes right now. And these are not counted in Canada's carbon footprint. So logging scars is foundational to this. And where we are going is we are calling for a new architecture that recognizes and addresses all of the terrestrial carbon exchanges. It is not currently included in the Paris Accord. It's not in international counting. We don't have any way of reporting on this. And therefore, what that means is we're not ascribing the carbon debts, and we're not finding ways to realize carbon credits, where companies could say, I'm choosing not to harvest this area and actually have it be recognized as a potential carbon credit. So I'll leave our discussion there and I'll turn it over to Anna. Anna.
Thanks, Janet. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so thank you. We've got some tales from the range to end our presentation, speaking specifically to forest policy and caribou conservation. So the four key messages I want to leave with you today are that, first of all, governments don't necessarily do the right thing when it comes to protecting our natural world. They need pressure and they need sustained public pressure. Even friendly governments that make environment a priority still need the public to speak up and keep pushing them in the right direction. The Ford government in Ontario has been reckless in pursuing a doubling of logging and using red tape reduction and a deregulation agenda to do it. So it's had some pretty serious consequences, and I'll have some up-to-date information to share with you on that. What this tells me is that, you know, it's up to all of us as, you know, citizens of Canada and residents of Ontario and residents of all these provinces. We just have to work even harder to scrutinize resource development projects. And we have to find ways to protect habitat, and we can't rely on our government to do that because they're failing us, certainly at the provincial level, and I'll share more reasons there. And then the question I'm going to hopefully provide a good answer to, and that certainly Janet and Dave have touched on, is instead of plowing into these primary forests, these remaining intact forests, you know, to make forest products like toilet paper and 2x4s, and then we're leaving these logging scars behind, how can we make room for one of the country's most iconic wildlife species? So just to give you a bit of a recap on Boreal caribou, in case you're not familiar with some of the characteristics of this critter and why it's finding itself at the crosshairs right now. It is a threatened species. It's also an indicator of a healthy boreal forest. So we don't just pick species because we like them or they have cute white fur below their chins. We also, this particular one is also indicator of a healthy boreal forest. So it has ecosystem implications. When the caribou start to decline, that's an indicator that our ecosystems are not in good shape and we should be paying attention. Boreal caribou require large tracts of undisturbed habitat, intact forests on a very large scale, often a couple million hectares in order to thrive, potentially larger. This puts them, as you can imagine, on a collision course with Canada's resource sector. And then the other thing that makes them so vulnerable is that they have a low reproductive potential and they're younger, vulnerable to predation. So they don't start reproducing until they're 6 years old, but they need to get to 6 years old before they can start. So there is quite a challenge there to even have the caribou thrive and reproduce. Caribou in Ontario, what's called the continuous distribution in Ontario covers a very large area, most of Northern Ontario, as you can see here. And it's, you can see the ranges, the ranges are delineated in black, and this information comes from 2017. You can see the numbers on each range, and the number you're looking for is 35. Are we keeping disturbance below 35? And that blue band of disturbance, that blue signifies disturbance in the southern part. That's where it overlaps with forestry. And you can also see the impacts. That would also include the impacts from mining, from roads, from highways, from towns. And so these southern ranges are not doing good. They're in bad shape. And the march of development goes on. And I'm going to zoom in on two ranges today just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what's going on. I just want to talk briefly about Churchill, and then I'm going to show what's going on. This one over here is called Kasagami. And then just to finally add, the latest information shows that a lot of these ranges are not in good shape. They're declining. So that means the calves are not the calves are not surviving, and females are not reproducing enough. We have been working on boreal caribou since 2001. And since 2008, the province has failed to bring in protections for boreal caribou consistent with the original intentions of the Endangered Species Act. Just on a quick pause here, up until 2008, we had resource statutes that were governing how we do resource statutes only, things like the forestry law, the mining law, EA law, and these statutes all have mitigation as the standard. So they promote development or they promote exploitation, and then they try and minimize harm to species. And so what we found is that didn't work. And that's why in 2007, many people got together, lawyers, scientists, concerned citizens, and we were successful in bringing in a new law called the Endangered Species Act. And that Endangered Species Act was supposed to turn the whole system on its head and start to prioritize the protection and recovery of species. Unfortunately, since 2008, we had a lot of optimism and hope, but in the last 12 years, the province has failed to do its job. And we at the Wildlands League, because we are solutions oriented, as Dave said, we tried everything, and we've exhausted all our avenues with the provincial government. I'll show you some of the solutions. I'll show you the work some of the other work we've been engaged in. But this is why in late 2008, we called on the federal government to intervene. And we asked the federal government to intervene in 2 specific ranges in northwestern Ontario that are particularly hard hit, the Churchill Range and the Bright Sand Range. Both these ranges have very high disturbance, low or declining population trend, and more disturbances on the horizon. And so we've asked the federal government to take the extraordinary step of using its species at risk legislation to step in and protect habitat in Northern Ontario. This is a live conversation, and we're still having conversations with the federal government. So we will, we can perhaps get more into that when we have our Q&A. Ontario, unfortunately, continues to abdicate its responsibilities to species at risk. And the latest, hot off the presses, what we're finding is that just last week, they introduced another omnibus bill that contained more attacks on the environment, 2 in particular on conservation authorities, and contained a permanent exemption for forestry. So this means that forestry, if passed, forestry operations will be permanently exempt from protecting and recovering species. And then, you know, if that wasn't enough, in terms of what the province was giving to the forest industry, they also have a clause that would prevent the Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks from using a species protection order or habitat protection order. So they're stacking the deck in favor of industry in our forests. So if I were to just give you a snapshot of where we are today, and we've kind of been under siege. So I was thinking about how could I best describe how we, you know, what we've been under siege. Our forests, you know, have been eroded in terms of their environmental oversight. So what do we, in terms of environmental assessment for forestry, it's gone. In terms of endangered species application, it's gone as well. In terms of the Environmental Bill of Rights, in terms of public participation, you know, the government has found ways to circumvent these rights. These are your rights that guarantee your right to participate in decision making, and the government's found ways to circumvent these. And in some cases, you know, it's been alleged that they've unlawfully removed those rights. So we'll see what happens there. So what we're left with is the Crown Forest Sustainability Act from 1994, and it is quite out of date and it needs to be reformed. And if you layer on top of that what the Ford government's doing, they're doubling logging, they have a deregulation agenda, they're leaving out the public, they're disrespecting Indigenous rights, and they're tilting everything in favor of industrial interests, which is going to give us more of what we don't want. If we shift to Kasagami, which is the range in northeastern Ontario, also heavily disturbed, more than 45%. That blue, it looks like blue to me, but it might look a bit green to you. That's all human-caused or anthropogenic disturbance. And you can see the northern part of this range is still has undisturbed, and that red is natural disturbance. So this is a range that you would think it would be hard to provide some solutions for it. But we've actually, because we have a good relationship with the industry here and local First Nations and the local municipality, have built a plan over the last 12 years called the Cochrane Plan. And it's based on collaboration, listening, and co-creating solutions. And so solutions are possible when you put your mind to it and you bring some creativity and flexibility. This is what the old plan looked like. We call it the status quo. Under that scenario, and we can talk more about it in the Q&A, what this looks like in terms of the clear-cutting approach and the dynamic caribou habitat schedule. But under this approach, species continue to decline, the companies aren't happy, and the First Nations aren't happy either. Our innovative, more collaborative, alternative approach looks like this. We start to look at where the caribou are and leaving them alone. We start to address the needs of the industry, and we get more responsive to the needs of the First Nations. And so you can see there are solutions out there. People just need to be able to be flexible and want to try them. The other part about this particular range, the Kasagami range that Janet talked about in terms of the North French, is that there is Moose Cree has designated a First Nation protected area in the heart of this range. And it serves many purposes. So you can see this range will not be able to be restored unless the North French is protected. And so Moose Cree's actually done quite a service by establishing a First Nation protected area here in the heart of this range to help restore caribou habitat. And we've been working with them to get Ontario to respect it in its laws. As Janet mentioned, it would be consistent with reconciliation to move ahead with a First Nation protected area here in a very threatened caribou range. Over 639 million tons of carbon is stored here. And so the co-benefits are clear. We're going to be protecting water, supporting culture, habitat, and climate. So in typical Wildlands League fashion, we find these solutions and then we find ways to make sure they hit a number of different factors and criteria. So just to recap, in terms of going forward, we're going to need all the voices we can to continue to put pressure on governments to make sure they do the right thing. Ontario's open for business approach is actually is changing the legal landscape. And, as you can see, with the exemptions to forestry from the ESA from forestry, we're very concerned about what's going to, how much environmental law is going to be left by the end of this mandate. It's up to all of us to work together and work even harder to scrutinize these projects. And there are positive examples of leadership that we can build on. And I just encourage you to make a difference in any way you can. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. And I'm just going to make one clarification. I think during my presentation, I'd said billions and it's millions. So I know I saw Anna put something in the chat room. So just look at the numbers. Thanks.
That's super. Those are great. I was taking notes as you guys were presenting, so I'm learning something today. That's it for us, I think, for today, for now. But we look forward to seeing you November 23rd in person in your class. So we hope we have great conversations about this topic and anything that flows out of that. Anything to add, Anna or Janet, before we sign off?
I would just say check out our work at loggingscars.ca. That will really give you some basis to drill down with us, and we look forward to the conversation because we're possessed by this work. so we really love talking about it.
Yeah, we're totally nerds and geeks, and we're happy to go as deep as you wish. And we didn't present all the information on all the caribou ranges, but I'm happy to go. For example, if you care about the Ring of Fire and you want us to jump in on the Mississauga range, I'm happy to go there. And we could also, we're very flexible. And we've got lots of experience, so we'll meet you where you are.
Yeah.
Great. We'll see you on the 23rd of November. Thanks.
Thank you.